let me now focus on the talk. Our study is dedicated to the processing of participial modifiers attached to a complex noun phrase in Russian. So the examples like one, конверт предназначался помощнику детектива, следившего за директором. So the envelope targeted the assistant dative masculine singular of, we don't need of because we have genitive, of the detective masculine genitive singular spying upon the director. So as you can see, modifiers, participial modifiers can be attached to the head, and this is traditionally called high attachment, or to the dependent noun, and this is traditionally called low attachment. In our study, we will focus on unambiguous sentences, but as I will mention in a minute, there is this long line of research focusing on ambiguous sentences where people have to choose the attachment side. And our goal here is to compare disambiguation by number, gender, and case. Because as you can see here in the example one, the attachment side is disambiguated by case. So we know that it's low attachment because the participle is in genitive and the dependent noun is in genitive while the head noun is in dative. But it can of course be the case that both nouns, for example, are in genitive and the attachment side is disambiguated by number or by the gender of the nouns. Or it can stay ambiguous if they coincide in all these three features. So Russian has two numbers, singular and plural, three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and six cases, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, instrumental, and locative. And there is actually a lot of case syncretism creating more room for ambiguity than you could initially suggest. And adjectives and participles agree with nouns in number, gender, in singular, and in case. So in the previous studies, high versus low attachment of modifiers was widely discussed, but most studies focused on ambiguous sentences, figuring out like which attachment side people choose if there is ambiguity, and most studies focused on relative clause modifiers. Some of them also focused on participial, sorry, not participial, but PP modifiers with prepositional phrases. And initially, the preference for low attachment a long time ago was described in English and assumed to be universal. And the late closure principle was introduced to account for it. But later, a lot of cross-linguistic variation was discovered. And we know now that some languages prefer low attachment while the others prefer high attachment. And our study, following like an earlier study by Daria, Chernova, myself, and some colleagues, we target the preference for low or high attachment. Sorry, in our study, we wanted to show that the preference for low and high attachment can also be studied in unambiguous sentences. If you look at, first of all, which forms are processed faster at online measures. So you can see whether online, in the same conditions, people prefer high or low attachment in unambiguous sentences, and in which cases interpretation errors are made. This is offline measure. So if, for example, in many sentences that have unambiguous low attachment, people choose high attachment when interpreting, it means that there is a preference for high attachment. So previous studies on Russian demonstrated that high attachment is preferred in ambiguous sentences, both with relative clauses and with participial modifiers. And they also demonstrated that in unambiguous sentences, low attachment is interpreted as high attachment more often than vice versa, which also points to this preference for high attachment. And also Chernova, myself and colleagues demonstrated that people make more errors in the sentences disambiguated by case than in the sentences disambiguated by number. And actually in the current study, we focus on this interesting distinction, and we decided to introduce gender feature into the picture to see whether the number of errors with gender would be higher or lower. So how do we explain the difference between number and case, and what can we expect from gender given this perspective? So number significantly affects the discourse representation of the referent. For example, if you have something like apple and apples, so these are different things in your discourse picture. And different case forms always refer to one and the same referent. inside singular or inside plural. So apple nominative, apple dative, or apple genitive is still an apple in the discourse. So case is needed to insert the noun phrase into the syntactic structure. And once you did this, it doesn't influence your discourse representation anymore. Of course, case affects like what thematic role you can get, for example, etc. But by itself, like once you are in the syntactic structure, you do not remember which case it was. So let's look at gender now. What can we expect from gender? Gender is a property of the lexeme, unlike number and case. So this should give it maybe some advantage because I mean, a noun has only one gender, but it can have different numbers in different cases. But gender doesn't affect the discourse representation in the sense number does. For the majority of nouns, gender is semantically empty in Russian. So for inanimate nouns, it doesn't mean anything. It's purely formal. For animate nouns denoting animals, it's like largely semantically empty. For example, for a dog, there is a word sabaka, which is feminine, and it can refer both to the like female dog and to the male dog. So there are just specific situations when you would choose a feminine or a masculine noun to denote female and male animals. So for people, for nouns denoting people, gender is not semantically empty, but still even there are some cases when you can refer to women using grammatically masculine words. So gender is much more problematic than number in this respect. But as long as you remember the noun itself, not just kind of the semantics behind it, you should be able to retrieve the number. So given all these, we initially suspected that the gender would be somewhere in the middle between number and case. It will be remembered better than case, but worse than number due to these discourse properties. So here is the design of our study. We conducted 2 experiments. So in the first one, we compared gender to case, and in the second one, we compared gender to number. Because putting all these things into one experiment would just give us too many experimental conditions in one study. So in the first experiment, 64 native speakers participated. In the second experiment, 65 native speakers. The procedure was a self-paced reading task. Plus, actually, this is not quite correct, not grammaticality judgments. We had comprehension, it's wrong. We had comprehension questions, which actually targeted for the target sentences, they targeted the attachment side. So we asked, for example, who, like if we come back to this sentence with the envelope, we would ask who followed the director, the assistant, or the detective. And for all the filler sentences that we had, we also had similar questions mentioning 2 participants or 2 objects that were introduced in the sentence. So target sentences did not stand out from like other sentences in this respect. And people actually did not notice what the experiment was about. Okay, so the variables, so the independent variables, the factors that we were exploring were morphological category, gender versus case in the first experiment, gender versus number in the second experiment. So what was used to disambiguate the attachment side, and the attachment type, high versus low. And the dependent variables were answering accuracy and word-by-word reading times. So here are some examples of our materials from the first experiment. So we had 24 sets of target sentences and in the 4 experimental conditions, and 76 filler sentences. So to give an example, the sentence in the gender high attachment condition would be something like «Дети спрятались от помощника директрисы, искавшего зачинщика в драке». So children hid from the assistant, masculine genitive singular, of the headmaster, feminine genitive singular, searching for the instigators of the fight. So this is disambiguated by number and disambiguated in favor of the high attachment. So in B, we have the same sentence disambiguated by gender in favor of the low attachment. And similar examples with case disambiguation in C and D. So in experiment 2, we had similar conditions, but not with gender and case, but with gender and number, again, the high attachment and low attachment versions of the experimental sentences. And like every sentence, both experimental and filler sentence was followed by questions. So now let me show what we got. So first of all, the reading times in the first experiment. Okay, thanks. So there were significant results only in the region 6. So where actually the participle was that had to be disambiguated in favor of the higher low attachment. And the participle was read significantly faster in the low attachment condition compared to the high attachment condition, which means that we got a low attachment preference online. And the category factor in the interaction were not significant. So now the accuracy rate for the first experiment. So both factors, both the category and the attachment were significant and their interaction was. And we can see that disambiguation by case caused more mistakes than disambiguation by gender. And actually the number of mistakes for the disambiguation by case is like really dramatic. So in the low attachment condition, people actually like make more than 50% mistakes. Yeah, and so it means that case is forgotten more easily than gender, and like on a truly surprising scale. And secondly, low attachment caused more mistakes than high attachment. So you can see this here. So this is the average for low attachment, this is the average for high attachment, the difference is quite big, which means that offline we have a preference for high attachment. So the online and offline preferences are different. Now the second experiment, so the reading times, there were significant results again only in the region 6 on the participle, and the participle was again read faster in the low attachment conditions than in the high attachment conditions, which again shows that we have a low attachment preference online, and the category factor was not significant. And the accuracy rate, as in the experiment 1, both factors and their interaction were significant, and disambiguation by number caused fewer mistakes than disambiguation by gender. So you can see the totals here. I mean, this difference is not that big, but it's significant. So and low attachment caused more mistakes than high attachment. So again, we have a strong, and this is this is a bigger difference. Again, we have a strong high attachment preference offline, like in the experiment 1. So what can we make out of this data? So both experiments showed that we have a low attachment preference online and the high attachment preference offline. Actually, in an early experiment by Daria, Chernova, myself, and colleagues, we had same offline results for participial modifiers, so high attachment preference offline, and we also tested ambiguous sentences in that study. So we could show it not only for unambiguous sentences, but also when people choose their interpretation for ambiguous sentences. Online results were not significant in that study, but the tendency was the same for low attachment conditions to be read faster online. So it's interesting given that in the experiments with relative clauses in Russian, you can see high attachment preference both online and offline. So what can we conclude? Potentially, the late closure principle might be universal after all, but only for the very immediate real-time processing. So the fact that the readers eventually prefer high attachment in some languages may have different explanations, and actually like at AmLab there were a lot of talks and there are a lot of papers like considering different explanations. Like I can give an example of the paper by João Costa and Nina Grillo in Cognition 2014, and so on and so forth. So in case of Russian, we would probably opt for Janet Fodor's prosodic principle. So Russian words are often long, so relative clauses and participial modifiers are really heavy. And we know from some independent experiments that the length factor really affects attachment references in Russian. So when you test really, really short relative clauses, preferences change a lot. So, in the experiment by Daria, Chernova, myself and colleagues, we also showed that there is no high or low attachment preference for PP modifiers, which are really short. So the fact that Russian relative clauses show a high attachment preference not only offline, but also online might indicate that their processing is less immediate than participial construction processing. So now let's look at different features. So disambiguation by gender was more effective than by case and less effective than by number. So our hypothesis was confirmed. Online differences between low attachment and high attachment sentences show that participants actually initially process all features effectively. So it's not that they miss the case or miss gender, or sometimes also miss the number of the nouns. Because otherwise we would have no differences between low and high attachment sentences online. Yeah? But then apparently some information is forgotten. Number is remembered better than gender, while case is forgotten on a truly unexpected scale. This is striking, given that Russian is a free word of the language, so speakers, generally speaking, heavily rely on case and parsing. But Chernova, myself, and colleagues had similar results in terms of case, also lots of mistakes. And we even used this in some subsequent studies where we needed sentences where people make a lot of interpretation errors. So we could repeat this result with low attachment sentences with participial modifiers, really like producing lots and lots and lots of interpretation errors. So in gender conditions in both experiments, we included animate and inanimate nouns, semantically loaded versus semantically empty gender features. There were more mistakes with inanimate nouns, but this factor was not statistically significant. So it's interesting to compare these results with some other tasks. So we have a recent paper by myself and a student of mine, Anastasia Ivanova, thanks, comparing gender and number agreement attraction in processing. So it's a totally different type of task. You do not have to choose where, say, a participial modifier is attached, but you see sentences with and without agreement errors on the predicate. And there is this additional factor of attraction, but actually in this particular experiment, there was attraction, but number and gender errors were not different in this respect. They were different, if you take any number agreement error with attraction or without it, and any gender agreement error with attraction or without it, gender agreement errors triggered significantly larger delays than number agreement errors. So we can conclude from here that gender is more salient than number for online agreement error detection. So it's not the case that gender is always less salient than number. It really depends on the task. Whether like you react to agreement attraction errors online, or you try, or you try to attach a participial modifier a little bit later. So why these results in this experiment? Potentially because gender is the property of the lexeme, while a number is a property of the form. And violating something that is true for the lexeme as a whole triggers bigger delays than violating something that is only true for the particular form of the noun. And actually, there are similar results from Romance languages showing that detecting gender errors induces more processing load than detecting number errors. But case, because Romance languages do not have a well-developed case system, case has never been included into this picture. And this gives us like a lot of room for further research on languages like Russian and other languages that have agreement in all the three features. And of course, we are also eager to take different tasks maybe to do like some EEG studies to see how these different features are computed in different tasks and show themselves in different measures. Thanks a lot. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Natalia, for the nice talk. We have 10 minutes for questions. Remember, students mic there and faculty here, and people online can also join the discussion by raising their hands and they will be called out. Okay, so let's start with the faculty mic, because is there anybody online? No, okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. Sol Lago, Goethe University. I was wondering about the one part of your interpretation when you say gender is forgotten or number is forgotten. Do you have, like, what would be the evidence that is actually being forgotten rather than it plays some role, say, initially, and then later people might go with something else, like the plausibility of which of the two possible options is the more likely, I don't know, agent for spying or whatever it is. So is there any evidence that the feature itself is getting forgotten?
Yeah, it might be kind of a more difficult question than the way I presented it. But the problem is that if the feature is salient in your memory, even like if the interpretation is not the most plausible, you should rely on the feature, because otherwise it's ungrammatical in Russian. Yeah. So if you, I wouldn't say forget is a strong word, but if the feature kind of becomes less salient in your memory, then you can have some room for like different interpretations. Otherwise, there is no room, because, for example, it's like in German. So if we have something like the fox accusative shot the hunter nominative, if case is salient enough, there are no options. So the sentence is semantically strange and so on and so forth, but still you have only one interpretation available. So it should become kind of really unsalient for you to have different options. And let me also say that, of course, for every sentence, I didn't mention that, but of course we did that, we controlled that both interpretations are quite plausible. So we had these like pilot studies where we asked people around whether both interpretations are plausible enough. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, Dustin Chacon, NYU Abu Dhabi. My thought isn't completely fully formed yet, but I'm curious about the explanation that you gave about the differences between the features and how they impact the discourse property. I was wondering if when you're looking at the differences between languages, whether another hypothesis that you considered or you might want to consider is which features are relevant for other relations outside of the noun phrase. So, I mean, I think in Russian you have both number and gender agreement with the verb, whereas in a lot of Romance languages you only have number agreement. So do you think that could also be a factor, right? So maybe comprehenders are having to attend to those features more or for longer periods of time for other possible relations with other phrases.
It might actually be a factor. One factor we are also actively considering is that in Russian you can see both, like everything you can see about number and gender and case. It's all on the noun or on the agreeing elements, because we have some undeclinable nouns too. In Romance languages, for example, you see number on the noun and gender on the article. So this can be potentially a huge difference. So this is why we are eager to repeat the experiments that people did on Romance languages using our Russian data to see whether the results would be the same or different. So yes, I think there is room for cross-linguistic differences. Also, as far as I understand, because we work on gender, not only like real-time gender agreement processing, but with a colleague of mine, Varya Magomedova, we have projects on gender of different like strange groups of Russian nouns. For example, we have this group of nouns that denotes professions and social roles that historically were masculine, and now they struggle, so some of them develop feminine versions, and actually some of them become common gender nouns. So, and actually I am the speaker who does not use that many feminitives traditionally. So I would call myself a linguist, not linguistka. And there are other Slavic languages where feminitives are almost obligatory in many cases, where in Russian they're almost prohibited. So that could also be an interesting place for cross-linguistic differences. Yeah.
Okay, cool, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I have to read it out. No, but there is a question from the chat. So they're asking, if I remember correctly, there was an interaction in experiment 2 in that there were more errors in the high attachment condition for number than for gender, but less in the low attachment condition. I might have missed your explanation for this effect.
So
it's Barbara M. for asking the message, the question.
Here, like the differences between number and gender were not numerically so big. So actually, to see whether this effect would stay this way, we actually want to recruit more participants, because right now we do not have like a ready explanation why it would be different. And if it gets repeated with a larger participant pool, then we will actually try to figure out why it is the case. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Björn Lundqvist, the University of Tromsø. Thanks, this is very interesting. This is mainly a clarification question. So I'm interested in the discrepancy between the online and offline results. And I just wonder, when you calculated the reading times, did you look at all trials or only the correct trials?
In this case, we looked only at the correct trials, but we also looked at all trials, and actually these things do not change. So the picture remains the same. Yeah.
All right, because I was worried that maybe if you only look at the correct trials, which is probably the correct way to do, but you might just focus on the good
picture,
readers.
The picture remains the same. Yeah, I should have mentioned that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
A quick follow-up to his questions about the reading times.
Yeah.
Did you measure, I mean, the results you present are on the verb region alone. Did you look at the spillover region?
Yes, we did. So they are on the participle region, and in the other regions, there are no significant differences. Yeah.
I think we should move to the next speaker now. Thanks, Natalia, again.
Yeah.